You want to hear about the time an entire HOA tried to steal my lake? And I mean literally steal it. Not just restrict access or complain about my dock, but actually claim ownership of a 40-acre private lake that I'd just dropped $500,000 to own. Picture this. I'm standing in my new kitchen, still surrounded by moving boxes, sipping coffee, and admiring the pristine water view I'd worked 15 years to afford, when I hear car doors slamming in my driveway. Not one car, 3 cars. I peek through the blinds and see what looks like a suburban invasion force marching toward my front door, led by a woman in a blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They're carrying folders, clipboards, and the kind of self-righteous expressions that spell trouble from a mile away. The doorbell rings, and when I open it, this woman, let's call her Margaret, doesn't even bother with pleasantries. She just looks me dead in the eye and says, "We need to discuss your illegal occupation of community property." My blood ran cold, not because I was scared, but because I realized I was about to deal with the kind of people who think they can rewrite property law through sheer audacity. But let me rewind and tell you how I ended up in this suburban warfare nightmare, because the backstory makes their stupidity even more delicious. I'm a water rights attorney, is people sue. Yeah, you heard that right. And after years of helping other people navigate complex property disputes, I finally had enough saved to buy my dream home. Not just any home, but a custom-built lakefront property on Lake Serenity, a private 40-acre lake in what used to be a quiet residential area. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Harold, had built the house in 1987 when the surrounding area was just farmland and forest. Over the years, developers had built upscale neighborhoods around the lake, but Harold's property remained the crown jewel, prime waterfront with private lake access and, most importantly, legal ownership of the lakebed itself. When Harold decided to retire to Florida, I jumped at the chance to buy not just his house, but his slice of paradise. The purchase was straightforward, or so I thought. Title search showed clear ownership dating back to the original land grant, mineral rights included, water rights locked down tighter than Fort Knox. I'm talking about documentation that would make a surveyor weep with joy, original deeds, updated surveys, water rights certificates, filed with both the county and state, the works. Harold had been meticulous about maintaining his legal claim to every square inch of that lake, including the springs that fed it and the outlet stream that drained it. During our closing meeting, he'd even chuckled and mentioned that some of the neighbors had gotten a little presumptuous over the years, but that the legal boundaries were crystal clear. I figured he meant the usual suburban stuff, people launching kayaks without permission, maybe some fishing trespassers. Boy, was I wrong. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week after I moved in. I was out on my dock, enjoying my morning coffee and planning where to put the boat lift I'd ordered, when I noticed something odd. There were people on the opposite shore, maybe 200 yards away, setting up what looked like a picnic area. No big deal, I thought. Maybe they're on their own waterfront property having a family gathering. But then I saw them launching a pontoon boat, and it was heading straight for my dock. As it got closer, I could see it was packed with people, and they were pointing at my house and talking animatedly. The boat pulled right up to my dock, my private dock, on my private lake, and this middle-aged guy in khaki shorts and a polo shirt climbed out like he owned the place. "Hey there, neighbor," he called out with the kind of forced friendliness that sets off every alarm bell in your head. "I'm Dave from the Lakeshore Community Association. We didn't get a chance to welcome you properly, so we thought we'd bring the whole gang out for a little meet and greet." I looked at the gang, about 8 adults and a handful of kids, all staring at me with the kind of intense curiosity usually reserved for zoo animals. "That's very thoughtful," I replied carefully, "but I should mention that this is private property, including the lake itself." The temperature of Dave's smile dropped about 20 degrees. "Oh, I think there might be some confusion about that," he said, still trying to maintain his neighborly facade. Lake Serenity has been a community resource for over 30 years. All the homeowners around here have access rights. That's when I knew I was dealing with people who had convinced themselves that wanting something badly enough makes it legally theirs. I kept my voice calm and professional, lawyer mode activated. I appreciate the welcome, but I need to clarify something. I own this lake outright, along with the mineral rights and water rights. It's not a community resource. It's private property with very clear legal boundaries. Dave's fake smile finally cracked. Look, I don't know what some realtor told you, but we've been using this lake for decades. Our kids learned to swim in this water. We've got boat slips and a community dock on the North Shore, and that's when he said the words that should have warned me just how deep this rabbit hole went. Margaret Whitman, our HOA president, is going to want to have a word with you about this. Margaret Whitman. Even now, saying that name makes my eye twitch slightly. If you could take every entitled, property line crossing, rule-wielding HOA president from every suburban nightmare story you've ever heard and roll them into one person, you'd get Margaret. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That first encounter with Dave ended with him reluctantly loading his welcome wagon back onto their pontoon boat, muttering something about getting this sorted out and checking the county records. I watched them motor back across my lake to what I could now see was indeed some kind of community dock setup on the far shore, complete with boat slips and a small pavilion. My first thought was that Harold had been way too generous in letting people use his lake over the years, and now I was going to have to be the bad guy who enforced the actual property lines. My second thought was that I should probably double-check my own paperwork just to make sure I had everything in order before the inevitable confrontation. That evening, I spread out all my closing documents on the dining room table and went through them with the thoroughness that had made me successful in water rights law. Property deed, clear ownership of the house, outbuildings, and 40 acres including the entire lakebed. Survey, detailed boundaries showing the lake entirely within my property lines. Water rights certificate, exclusive rights to the water source, including springs and natural flow. Title insurance, comprehensive coverage against any claims to the property. Mineral rights, included and verified. Everything was absolutely, unquestionably, legally bulletproof. But something was nagging at me about that community dock Dave had mentioned. If Harold had really owned the entire lake for over 30 years, how had an entire neighborhood convinced themselves they had community access rights? And more importantly, how had they built permanent structures on property they didn't own? I decided to do a little reconnaissance of my own. The next morning, I took my kayak and paddled over to the North Shore to get a closer look at their setup. What I found was way more extensive than I'd realized from a distance. We're talking about a full-scale community recreation area, multiple boat slips, a large wooden dock system, a covered pavilion, picnic tables, even a small sandy beach area with lounge chairs. Someone had invested serious money and effort into this operation. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures, because my lawyer instincts were screaming that I was going to need documentation. That's when I noticed something interesting about the dock system. It wasn't just built on my property. It was anchored to my property with permanent concrete footings. Someone had literally built a commercial-grade dock operation on land they didn't own, complete with electrical hookups and what looked like plumbing for a restroom facility. The level of audacity was breathtaking. But what really caught my attention was a small metal sign mounted on the main dock. Lakeshore Community Association, members only, violations will be prosecuted. They had put up a threatening sign about prosecuting violations on my property. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I was paddling back toward my own dock, mind racing through the legal implications of what I'd just discovered, when I heard an engine behind me. I turned to see a speedboat approaching fast, throwing up a wake that rocked my kayak pretty aggressively. The boat pulled alongside me, and I recognized Dave from the day before. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were 2 other men with him, and their demeanor was decidedly less welcoming than yesterday's fake friendliness. "We need to talk," Dave called out over the engine noise. "Margaret wants to meet with you today to clear up this property line confusion." I steadied my kayak and looked up at the three men in their boat, noting the body language that said this wasn't really a request. "I'm not confused about my property lines," I replied evenly, "but I'm certainly interested in talking about that dock system you've built on my land." The guy at the wheel of the boat? A stocky man with a sun-weathered face and the kind of mustache that screams retired cop or military, leaned forward. "Look, son, you seem like a reasonable person, but you're new here and you don't understand how things work. We've been maintaining this lake for decades, while that old hermit sat in his house and did nothing. We've got sweat equity and investment in these facilities." Sweat equity, investment. These people were trying to claim adverse possession of my property through improvements they'd made without permission. I almost laughed out loud at the legal absurdity of it. But something in their faces told me this was about to get more complicated than a simple trespassing issue. "I understand your position," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand mine. This is private property with clear legal title, and any improvements made without the owner's consent are made at your own risk." The mustache guy's face darkened. "Margaret's expecting you at the community center at 2 o'clock today. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." And with that ominous parting shot, they gunned the engine and roared back toward their illegal dock, leaving me bobbing in their wake and wondering what exactly I'd gotten myself into. That afternoon, I found myself driving to the Lakeshore Community Center, a fancy building that served as the HOA headquarters for the various neighborhoods surrounding my lake. I decided to hear them out, partly out of professional curiosity about just how delusional their legal position was, and partly because I wanted to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with before I made my next move. The community center was exactly what you'd expect from an upscale suburban HOA, all blonde wood and neutral colors, with motivational posters about community spirit and property values. Margaret was waiting for me in a conference room, flanked by Dave and Mustache Guy, whose name turned out to be Frank, along with two other people I didn't recognize. Margaret Whitman was a specimen, and I mean that in the most clinical sense possible. Imagine if you took every Karen stereotype from every social media meme and gave it a law degree and 20 years of HOA experience. She was probably in her late 50s, with that aggressively maintained blonde hair that looks like it could deflect bullets, wearing a business suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But it was her eyes that really got your attention, the kind of cold, calculating gaze that suggested she was already 3 moves ahead in whatever chess game she thought we were playing. She didn't stand up when I entered the room, just gestured to a chair across from her like she was conducting a job interview. "Mr. Johnson," she began, consulting a thick folder that I assumed contained whatever research they'd done on me and my property, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of Lake Serenity and the community's relationship with this valuable resource." I settled into my chair and activated full lawyer mode. "I'm listening," I said simply, knowing that the best strategy was to let them lay out their entire position before I responded. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes and usually precedes an offer you can't refuse. Lake Serenity has been managed as a community asset for over 30 years. The Lakeshore Community Association, representing over 200 homeowners across 4 neighborhoods, has maintained and improved the lake facilities through volunteer labor and community assessments. She slid a document across the table toward me. "This is a usage agreement that was signed by your predecessor, Harold Morrison, in 1995. As you can see, it grants the community permanent access rights to the lake in exchange for maintenance and improvement responsibilities." I picked up the document and scanned it quickly, my legal training allowing me to spot the problems immediately. First, it wasn't notarized. Second, it wasn't recorded with the county. Third, and most importantly, Harold's signature looked like it had been written by someone with Parkinson's disease using their non-dominant hand. This wasn't just a questionable document. It was an obvious forgery, and not even a particularly good one. "This is interesting," I said, setting the paper back down on the table, "but I'm afraid it has no legal validity. It's not notarized, not recorded, and frankly, the signature doesn't match any of the authentic Harold Morrison signatures in my closing documents." Margaret's smile tightened slightly, but she wasn't backing down. The signature was witnessed by 3 community members, all of whom are prepared to testify to its authenticity. And I think you'll find that 30 years of continuous use and improvement constitutes a valid claim regardless of paperwork technicalities. That's when I knew we were dealing with people who weren't just delusional. They were actively criminal, forging documents, making false claims about property ownership, threatening legal action based on fabricated evidence. This wasn't just an HOA overreach situation. This was conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. But I kept my expression neutral and my voice calm. "I understand your position," I said, "but I need you to understand mine. I have clear legal title to this property, including the entire lake. Any use agreements would have been disclosed during the sale, and any legitimate claims would have appeared in the title search. What you're describing simply doesn't exist in the legal record." Dave leaned forward, trying to play good cop to Margaret's bad cop. "Look, we're not trying to take your property away from you. We just want to maintain the status quo that's worked for everyone for decades. You get to enjoy your lakefront home. We get to continue using the facilities we've built and maintained. Everybody wins." I almost laughed at the transparent attempt at manipulation. Except that the status quo involves permanent structures built on my property without permission, and use of my lake without any legal right to do so. That's not a status quo, that's trespassing and conversion of private property. Frank, the mustache guy, had been quiet up to this point, but now he spoke up with the kind of voice that suggested he was used to people doing what he told them. "Son, you're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work in this community. We're reasonable people, but we're also not going to be pushed around by some city lawyer who thinks he can come in here and change 30 years of tradition overnight. The smart play here is to work with us, not against us." The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. I looked around the table at their faces, Margaret's cold calculation, Dave's fake reasonableness, Frank's barely contained hostility, and the 2 silent observers who were probably there as witnesses to whatever they thought was going to happen. These people had convinced themselves that they owned my lake, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to maintain that delusion. "I appreciate your position," I said again, standing up to signal that the meeting was over. "But I'm going to need some time to review my options. I assume you'll respect my property rights while I consider how to proceed?" Margaret's mask finally slipped completely. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. This community has significant resources and influence. We have lawyers, political connections, and 30 years of documented use of this lake. If you try to interfere with our legitimate rights, we'll take every legal action available to protect our interests. And I should mention that property values in this area depend heavily on lake access. It would be unfortunate if your aggressive stance affected not only your own investment, but the investments of all your neighbors." There it was, the naked threat. Not just legal action, but economic warfare designed to force me into compliance. I smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Thank you for clarifying your position, Margaret. I think I have everything I need to make an informed decision." I headed for the door, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Mr. Johnson, we expect a response within 48 hours. After that, we'll assume you're choosing the difficult path, and we'll respond accordingly." I paused at the door and looked back at her. "Margaret, I am the difficult path. I specialize in water rights law. I have clear legal title to that lake, and I've been dealing with people who confuse wanting something with owning it for my entire career. You've just threatened me with economic harm and legal action based on a forged document and 30 years of trespassing. The next time we meet, it'll be in court, and I promise you won't like how that conversation goes." The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened and plan my next moves. These people weren't just entitled neighbors, they were organized, funded, and apparently willing to commit fraud to maintain their claim on my property. But they'd also just made several critical mistakes. First, they'd threatened me in front of witnesses. Second, they'd presented me with evidence of document forgery. Third, they'd essentially admitted to 30 years of trespassing and conversion of private property. From a legal standpoint, they'd just handed me everything I needed to destroy them in court. But before I started down the litigation path, I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with. That evening, I did what any good lawyer does when preparing for war. I researched my opponents. Margaret Whitman turned out to be a piece of work. Former real estate agent, current HOA president for multiple communities, and plaintiff in over a dozen property disputes over the past decade. Her pattern was always the same. Find some technical or procedural angle to challenge property rights, usually involving easements or usage claims, then use the HOA's resources to fund lengthy litigation until the other party gave up or agreed to a settlement. She'd made a career out of being a professional property predator. Dave Harrison was her lieutenant, a retired middle manager who'd found new purpose in HOA politics. Frank Mueller was ex-military, currently working as a private security contractor, and apparently Margaret's go-to guy when intimidation was called for. The other two people in the meeting were HOA board members from neighboring communities, there to show unified support for Margaret's position. What I found most interesting, though, was the financial structure behind their operation. The Lakeshore Community Association wasn't just collecting dues from homeowners, Dr. Mann. They were running a significant business operation around the lake facilities, including boat slip rentals, event hosting, and what appeared to be a summer camp program for local kids. They weren't just claiming ownership of my lake, they were making money off it. Lots of money. According to the financial documents I found in public records, the LCA had pulled in over $200,000 the previous year from lake-related activities. No wonder they were willing to fight so hard to maintain their claim. But here's where their greed had made them vulnerable. By operating a commercial enterprise on property they didn't own, they'd opened themselves up to not just trespassing charges, but conversion and unjust enrichment claims. In lawyer terms, they were about to get absolutely destroyed. But I decided to give them one more chance to be reasonable before I unleashed the legal nuclear option. The next morning, I sent Margaret a certified letter laying out the facts. I owned the lake, they were trespassing, their usage agreement was forged, and they had 48 hours to begin removing their structures from my property. I kept the tone professional, but made it clear that continued trespassing would result in immediate legal action and criminal charges where applicable. I also mentioned that I'd be filing a complaint with the district attorney regarding the forged document they'd presented. The response came faster than I expected, but not in the form I anticipated. I was working in my home office when I heard vehicles in my driveway again. This time, it wasn't just Margaret and her core team. It was a convoy, 3 SUVs, a pickup truck, and what looked like a contractor's van. I counted at least 15 people getting out of the vehicles, including several I recognized from the community dock area. They were carrying signs, clipboards, and what appeared to be surveying equipment. Margaret was leading the parade, dressed in her power suit and carrying a briefcase like she was about to foreclose on an orphanage. I met them at my front door, phone in hand and recording everything, because I had a feeling this was about to get interesting. "Good morning, Margaret," I said pleasantly. "What brings you and half the neighborhood to my property today?" She smiled that cold smile again and gestured to her entourage. "Mr. Johnson, we're here to conduct a comprehensive survey of the disputed property boundaries. We have reason to believe that your property lines don't extend as far into the lake as you claim, and we intend to verify the actual boundaries today." The audacity was breathtaking. They were going to conduct their own survey of my property to prove that I didn't own what I clearly owned. "I'm afraid I can't allow unauthorized surveying of my private property," I replied. If you have questions about the boundaries, you are welcome to review the official survey that was conducted during my purchase. Or you can hire a licensed surveyor to work with my surveyor to resolve any legitimate disputes through proper channels. Frank stepped forward, and I could see he was carrying what looked like surveying stakes and a measuring tape. Son, we're not asking for permission. We have a right to verify property boundaries when they affect community resources. You can cooperate or you can get out of the way. But we're doing this survey today. That's when I noticed something else. Several of the people in the group were carrying cameras, and at least one had what looked like professional video equipment. They weren't just planning to trespass and conduct an illegal survey, they were planning to document it, probably to use in some kind of social media campaign or legal filing. I need to be very clear about something, I said, making sure my voice would be picked up by their recording equipment. This is private property. I am the legal owner, and I am explicitly denying permission for any surveying, measuring, or other activities on my land. If you proceed, you will be trespassing, and I will call law enforcement immediately. Margaret's smile got even colder. Mr. Johnson, I think you'll find that property owners don't have the right to prevent verification of legitimate boundary disputes. We're operating under the authority of the County Planning Commission and the Community Association's legal rights. That was a lie, and we both knew it. County planning commissions don't authorize private citizens to trespass and conduct surveys. And community associations have no legal authority over private property boundaries. But she was counting on me not knowing that, or being intimidated enough to back down. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Yes, I need to report a large group of people who are trespassing on my private property and threatening to conduct unauthorized activities despite being explicitly told to leave. The 911 operator asked me to stay on the line while she dispatched officers, and I was happy to comply, especially since Margaret's group could hear every word of the conversation. I watched their confidence start to crack as I provided my address, described the situation, and confirmed that yes, I was the legal property owner, and no, I had not given permission for any of these activities. Dave tried to salvage the situation by suggesting they could wait for law enforcement to arrive and sort out the misunderstanding. But Margaret was smarter than that. She knew that when the police showed up and saw a large group of people with surveying equipment on someone's private property without permission, it wasn't going to go well for them. "We'll be back," she announced, gathering her troops for a tactical retreat. "This isn't over, Mr. Johnson. We have legal rights, and we intend to exercise them." I watched them load back into their convoy and drive away, but not before several of them made a point of taking pictures of my house, my car, and my property. The message was clear. This was personal now, and they wanted me to know they were keeping tabs on me. 20 minutes later, Deputy Sheriff Martinez arrived to take my statement. He was a middle-aged Hispanic man with the kind of calm professionalism that suggested he'd dealt with suburban property disputes before. I walked him through the situation, showed him my property documents, and provided him with copies of the forged usage agreement Margaret had presented. His eyebrows went up when he saw that. "They actually showed you a forged document and claimed it was legitimate?" he asked. "Yes, and they threatened legal and economic retaliation when I pointed out the problems with it," I replied. "I believe they're operating some kind of commercial enterprise on my property without permission, and they're willing to use fraud and intimidation to maintain their claim." Deputy Martinez took detailed notes and photos, including shots of the community dock system visible across the lake. "Mr. Johnson, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain about your property boundaries? Because if you're wrong about owning that lake, this becomes a very different situation." I appreciated his thoroughness and walked him through my title documents, survey results, and water rights certificates. His expression grew more serious as he reviewed the paperwork. "This is pretty bulletproof," he admitted. "I'm going to need to file a report about the threatened trespassing and the document forgery. You might want to consider getting a restraining order if they continue to harass you." That evening, I sat on my dock with a beer, and tried to process the surreal turn my peaceful lake house purchase had taken. In less than 2 weeks, I'd gone from new homeowner to target of an organized fraud scheme. But as I watched the sun set over my lake, I realized that Margaret and her crew had made a fundamental miscalculation. They were used to dealing with intimidated homeowners who didn't understand their rights or couldn't afford to fight back. They'd never tangled with someone who specialized in exactly this type of property dispute and had both the knowledge and resources to fight back hard. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Last chance to be reasonable. Community meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m. Your attendance is mandatory. I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Deputy Martinez because threatening messages were now evidence in what was rapidly becoming a criminal case. Then I sat back in my chair and started planning my counterattack. Because Margaret Whitman was about to learn why you don't threaten a water rights attorney with a very clear legal title and a very short tolerance for bullies. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of their operation, and that meant a little detective work. The next morning, I drove to the county courthouse and spent several hours in the records office, pulling every document related to the Lakeshore Community Association and the various HOAs that surrounded my property. What I found was a pattern of aggressive expansion dating back over a decade. Margaret had systematically targeted properties with any kind of water access, using a combination of legal challenges, HOA pressure, and strategic harassment to force property owners into settlements that granted the community association permanent usage rights. In 3 cases, property owners had actually been forced to sell their homes after years of legal battles they couldn't afford to sustain. In 2 others, owners had agreed to lease portions of their waterfront property to the association for token amounts, just to make the harassment stop. Margaret hadn't just been running an HOA, she'd been running a sophisticated property acquisition scheme, using the association's resources and legal threats to build an empire of illegally obtained access rights. But she'd never targeted someone with my background and resources. And she'd definitely never been stupid enough to present forged documents as evidence. I now had enough information to not only defend my property, but to potentially unravel years of fraudulent schemes affecting multiple families. The scope of what I was dealing with was much bigger than just my lake. This was an organized criminal enterprise disguised as suburban community management. I decided not to attend their mandatory community meeting, partly because I don't take orders from trespassers, and partly because I was busy preparing the legal equivalent of a nuclear strike. That evening, while Margaret was presumably holding court and riling up her supporters, I was in my office drafting complaints to the district attorney, the State Bar Association, and the County Planning Commission. I was also preparing civil suits for trespassing, conversion, unjust enrichment, fraud, and conspiracy. But most importantly, I was researching the one piece of leverage that was going to end this whole thing: the water rights. See, here's what Margaret and her crew never bothered to investigate before they started their intimidation campaign. I didn't just own the lakebed and the water rights, I controlled the water source itself. Lake Serenity was fed by 3 natural springs on my property and drained through a single outlet stream that I also owned. The lake existed because Harold Morrison's predecessor had dammed the outlet in the 1940s to create a recreational lake. But here's the beautiful part. As the owner of both the springs and the outlet, I had absolute control over the water level in the lake. Those fancy boat slips and that expensive dock system they'd built on my property, they were all designed for a specific water level. Lower the lake by just 3 feet, and their entire operation becomes useless. Lower it by 6 feet, and their docks would be sitting on dry land. I had the legal right to drain my lake whenever I wanted, for any reason I wanted, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. But I wasn't ready to play that card yet. First, I wanted to give Margaret one final chance to see reason, and I wanted to document her response for the legal proceedings that were coming. The next morning, I sent her a comprehensive certified letter laying out the entire situation. clear documentation of my ownership, evidence of their trespassing and fraud, an itemized bill for 30 years of unauthorized use of my property, and a final demand for removal of all structures within 30 days. I also included a little bonus: copies of the water rights certificates showing my control over the lake's water source, along with a polite mention that continued harassment might force me to consider alternative property management strategies. I figured a former real estate agent would understand the implications of that phrase. The response came that afternoon, not by mail or phone, but in the form of a literal parade. I was working in my office when I heard car horns honking in a pattern, not random traffic noise, but an organized cacophony designed to get my attention. I looked out the window to see a convoy of vehicles driving slowly past my house, circling around the dead-end road and passing by again and again and again. There were at least 20 cars, SUVs, and trucks, many with passengers holding signs reading "Save Lake Serenity" and "Stop Property Greed" and "Community Rights Matter." They kept this up for over an hour, creating a rolling parade of harassment designed to make my life miserable while staying technically within the bounds of legal protest. It was actually pretty clever from a tactical standpoint, annoying as hell without being clearly illegal. But what they didn't realize was that I was recording everything from multiple angles, building a comprehensive documentation of their organized harassment campaign. The parade finally broke up around dinner time, but that wasn't the end of the day's festivities. Around 8 p.m., I noticed lights across the lake at their illegal dock facility. Not just a few lights, floodlights. Like they were setting up for some kind of major event. I grabbed my binoculars and took a look, and what I saw made me laugh out loud despite everything. They were having a rally, a full-scale signs and speakers rally about saving Lake Serenity from the evil property owner who actually owned Lake Serenity. I could see Margaret on what appeared to be a makeshift stage, gesturing dramatically while a crowd of maybe 50 people held up their protest signs. The whole scene was so absurd that I almost felt sorry for the people who'd been dragged into Margaret's delusional crusade. Almost. But then I remembered the forged documents, the threats, and the organized harassment, and my sympathy evaporated. These people had chosen their side, and they were about to learn what happens when you try to steal someone's property through fraud and intimidation. The next morning brought a new escalation. I was having my coffee on the dock when I heard the sound of heavy machinery. I looked across the lake to see a construction crew setting up near the community dock area. Not just a few workers with hand tools, we're talking about a full construction operation with heavy equipment, material trucks, and what looked like the foundation work for a major building project. They were expanding their illegal facilities on my property while actively engaged in a legal dispute over ownership. The audacity was breathtaking, but it was also exactly the kind of evidence I needed to destroy them in court. I grabbed my camera and started documenting everything. Wide shots of the construction site, close-ups of the equipment, photos of the workers and supervisors, license plates on all the vehicles. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was aggravated trespassing with extensive property damage. In legal terms, they'd just upgraded their misdemeanor to a felony. I called Deputy Martinez to report the ongoing construction on my property. He sounded tired when he answered, like he'd been expecting this call. "Mr. Johnson, how certain are you that the construction is actually on your property and not on adjacent land?" It was a fair question, and I had a fair answer. "Deputy, I'm looking at my survey right now, and the construction is happening at least 50 yards inside my property line. I can meet you there with the official survey if you want to verify the boundaries." An hour later, I met Deputy Martinez and his partner at the construction site. The crew was in full swing, pouring concrete footings for what appeared to be a large pavilion or community center. The supervisor, a weathered man in his 50s wearing a hard hat and tool belt, approached us warily. "Officers, is there a problem? We have all the necessary permits for this work." "Can I see those permits?" Deputy Martinez asked. The supervisor handed over a folder of documents, which the deputy reviewed carefully. These permits are issued to the Lakeshore Community Association for construction on Lot 47 of the Lakeshore development, he noted. But according to this survey, we're standing on property owned by Mr. Johnson, not the community association. The supervisor looked confused and slightly panicked. I don't know anything about a property dispute. We were hired by the association to build a community center, and they provided all the permits and site plans. If there's a problem with the location, you need to talk to Margaret Whitman. Deputy Martinez turned to me. Mr. Johnson, I need to ask you to be very clear about your intentions here. Are you asking me to stop this construction and charge these people with trespassing? I looked at the concrete footings that were already poured, the foundation work that was underway, and the crew of workers who were just trying to do their jobs. Deputy, I want the construction stopped immediately, and I want the property restored to its original condition. As for charges, I'll leave that up to your discretion, but I want it clearly documented that this construction was done without my permission on my property. What happened next was like watching a controlled demolition of Margaret's entire scheme. Deputy Martinez ordered the construction stopped and the site secured as potential evidence in a criminal case. The workers were sent home, but not before being questioned about who had hired them and provided their permits. The supervisor had to call Margaret to explain why his crew was being shut down by law enforcement, and I got to watch his face go through a fascinating range of expressions as she apparently unleashed a tirade of abuse on him. But the real fun started when Margaret herself arrived on the scene, driving her white Lexus SUV like she was rushing to a house fire. She practically leaped out of the vehicle and marched over to Deputy Martinez with a kind of righteous fury that suggested she genuinely believed she was the victim in this situation. "Officer, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "We have legal permits for this construction, and this man has no right to interfere with legitimate community improvements." Deputy Martinez, to his credit, maintained his professional composure in the face of Margaret's histrionics. "Ma'am, the permits you provided authorize construction on property owned by the Lakeshore Community Association. However, according to the official survey, this construction is taking place on property owned by Mr. Johnson. Can you provide documentation showing that the association owns this land?" And that's when Margaret made the mistake that was going to cost her everything. Instead of admitting that there might be some confusion about the property boundaries, or suggesting that they needed to review the legal documents, she doubled down on her lie. "Officer, this property has been owned and managed by the community association for over 30 years. We have extensive documentation of our ownership rights, including usage agreements with the previous property owner." She actually pulled out the same forged document she'd shown me earlier and handed it to Deputy Martinez as proof of her claim. I watched his face as he examined the obviously fraudulent paperwork, and I could see the moment when he realized he was dealing with an active criminal rather than a confused neighbor. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this document doesn't appear to be notarized or officially recorded. Do you have any other evidence of ownership?" Margaret's voice took on the shrill tone of someone who was used to bullying people into submission and couldn't understand why her usual tactics weren't working. "I don't need to prove anything to you, officer. This community has rights, and we're not going to be intimidated by some outsider who thinks he can come in here and steal our lake." That's when Deputy Martinez asked the question that I'd been waiting for someone in authority to ask. "Ma'am, are you claiming that you own this property? Or are you claiming some kind of usage right? Because if you're claiming ownership, I need to see a deed or title certificate. And if you're claiming usage rights, I need to see a legal easement or lease agreement." The look on Margaret's face was priceless. She'd spent so many years bullying people with vague legal threats and intimidation tactics that she'd apparently forgotten how actual property law works. When confronted by someone who understood the difference between legal documents and bureaucratic bluffing, her entire house of cards started to collapse. "We, the community, 30 years of use," she stammered, apparently unable to form a coherent legal argument. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remove this construction equipment and any materials from Mr. Johnson's property immediately," Deputy Martinez said firmly. "If you believe you have a legitimate legal claim to this land, you need to pursue that through the civil court system. But until a court rules otherwise, this is private property, and you don't have permission to be here." Margaret looked like she was about to explode, but she managed to contain her rage long enough to gather her dignity and storm back to her SUV. Before she left, though, she turned and pointed at me with the kind of dramatic gesture you see in soap operas. "This isn't over, Johnson. You have no idea what you're dealing with, or what this community is capable of when we're pushed too far." It was such a perfect villain speech that I almost applauded. But instead, I just smiled and waved as she drove away, leaving behind a construction site full of equipment and materials that she was now legally required to remove from my property. The whole confrontation had been captured on body cameras, recorded on my phone, and witnessed by multiple construction workers. Margaret had just provided me with everything I needed to pursue criminal charges for fraud, trespassing, and making false statements to law enforcement. That evening, I sat on my dock with another beer and reflected on how quickly things had escalated. In less than 3 weeks, I'd gone from peaceful lakefront homeowner to the target of an organized criminal conspiracy. But I'd also systematically documented every aspect of their scheme, gathered evidence of fraud and trespassing, and maneuvered them into a position where they had no legal defense for their actions. The end game was approaching, and I had one card left to play: the nuclear option that would end this whole thing permanently. But first, I wanted to see how far Margaret was willing to go to maintain her delusion of ownership over my property. The answer came sooner than I expected. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of chainsaws. Not the distant sound of tree trimming in someone's yard, but the immediate, aggressive sound of chainsaws operating on my property. I threw on clothes and ran outside to find a crew of men cutting down trees along my waterfront, apparently trying to clear more space for their illegal dock expansion. They'd come onto my property at dawn and started destroying my trees without permission, authorization, or any legal right whatsoever. I immediately called 911 and started recording everything, but the damage was already being done. These weren't just any trees. They were mature oaks and maples that had been growing for decades, providing shade and privacy for my waterfront. The crew was working efficiently and methodically, like they'd done this before, taking down trees that would have cost thousands of dollars to remove legally and probably taken months to get permits for. By the time law enforcement arrived, the crew had already felled 6 large trees and was working on a 7th. Deputy Martinez took one look at the situation and immediately called for backup and a supervisor. What had started as a property dispute was now clearly organized criminal activity: trespassing, destruction of property, and what appeared to be an ongoing conspiracy to steal land through intimidation and fraud. The tree-cutting crew was arrested on the spot, but not before I learned something interesting. They'd been told by Margaret that the land was owned by the community association and that they had full legal authority to clear trees for a new construction project. She hadn't just committed fraud, she'd involved innocent contractors in her scheme by lying about property ownership and legal authority. But Margaret wasn't finished escalating. That afternoon, while I was dealing with insurance adjusters and documenting the tree damage, she made her final, fatal mistake. I was standing in my yard surveying the destruction when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Enjoying your lake, Mr. Johnson?" I turned to see Margaret standing at the edge of my property, flanked by Dave and Frank and 2 other men I didn't recognize. "Technically, it's my lake," I replied calmly, "and you're trespassing on my property again." Margaret smiled that cold smile and pulled out her phone. "Not for much longer. I've been in contact with the county planning office, and it turns out there are some very interesting environmental regulations that apply to private lakes. Regulations that carry some hefty fines and potential criminal charges for violations." She held up her phone so I could see she was recording our conversation. "Mr. Johnson, are you aware that it's illegal to artificially alter the water levels of a natural lake without proper environmental permits? Because if you're planning to drain Lake Serenity out of spite, as you've threatened to do, You'll be facing federal criminal charges for environmental destruction." And that's when I realized that Margaret had done exactly what I'd hoped she would do. She'd researched my water rights and discovered that I had the legal authority to control the lake's water levels. But in her arrogance and desperation, she'd missed the most important detail. I already had all the necessary permits. "Margaret," I said, smiling for the first time in weeks, "I appreciate your concern for environmental regulations. As a water rights attorney, I'm very familiar with the relevant laws. In fact, I'm so familiar with them that I obtained all the necessary permits before I even closed on this property. I have legal authorization from both the State Environmental Agency and the federal EPA to manage water levels in this lake for maintenance, conservation, and property management purposes." I pulled out my phone and showed her the permits I'd obtained months ago, back when I was still planning to build a boathouse and maybe install a fountain system. "I'm fully authorized to lower the lake level by up to 10 feet for any legitimate property management purpose. And dealing with trespassers and illegal structures definitely qualifies as a legitimate purpose." The look on Margaret's face was worth every moment of harassment I'd endured. She'd just realized that not only did I have the legal right to drain the lake, but I had the permits to do it without any environmental consequences. All those expensive boat slips and dock systems her community had built were about to become very expensive piles of wood sitting in a muddy field. "You wouldn't dare," she whispered, but I could hear the fear in her voice. "You'd destroy the property values for every home around this lake. You'd ruin the entire community out of spite." I shook my head. "I wouldn't destroy anything out of spite, Margaret. But I would certainly exercise my legal property rights to protect my land from trespassers and remove illegal structures that were built without permission. What happens to property values is entirely up to you and your community. Remove your illegal structures, stop trespassing on my land, and the lake stays exactly as it is. Continue with this harassment and fraud, and I'll be forced to take more dramatic property management measures." Frank stepped forward like he was going to try to intimidate me physically, but I held up my phone. "I'm recording this conversation, Frank, and there are already criminal charges pending against your boss for fraud and trespassing. Do you really want to add assault and battery to that list?" He stopped moving, but his face made it clear that he was barely containing his rage. Margaret regrouped quickly, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of her position. "Mr. Johnson, let's be reasonable here. This community has invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in lake facilities over the years. Surely we can work out some kind of arrangement that protects everyone's interests." For the first time since this whole thing started, she was actually talking like a rational person instead of a delusional property thief. But it was too little, too late. "Margaret, I made you a reasonable offer weeks ago. I asked you to remove your illegal structures and stop trespassing on my property. Instead, you threatened me, harassed me, presented forged documents, and had my trees cut down without permission. You've made it very clear that you're not interested in reasonable arrangements. You want to steal my property through intimidation and fraud." I looked around at her little group of supporters, noting that they all looked significantly less confident than they had when this conversation started. "Here's my final offer. You have 48 hours to remove every structure, dock, sign, and piece of equipment from my property. You have 48 hours to restore my waterfront to its original condition, including paying for replacement of the trees that were illegally cut down. And you have 48 hours to provide full financial accounting of every dollar you've made from illegal commercial activities on my land over the past 30 years. Margaret's mouth dropped open. "You can't be serious. That's millions of dollars in structures and decades of investment." I nodded. "Yes, it is. And all of it was built on stolen property without permission from the legal owner. If you'd rather handle this through the court system, I'm happy to file criminal charges for fraud, trespassing, conspiracy, and racketeering, along with civil suits for conversion, unjust enrichment, and 30 years of unpaid rent on my property." The silence stretched out for almost a minute while Margaret processed the reality of her situation. Finally, Dave tried to play peacemaker one more time. Look, maybe we all got off on the wrong foot here. Can't we work something out that doesn't destroy the whole community? I felt a moment of genuine sympathy for Dave and the other people who'd been caught up in Margaret's scheme. Most of them probably had no idea they were involved in criminal activity. They'd just been told that the lake was a community resource and that they had legitimate access rights. Dave, I'm not interested in destroying the community. I'm interested in protecting my property rights and stopping organized criminal activity. If your community wants to discuss legitimate lease arrangements for dock facilities, I'm open to those conversations. But any such arrangements would be based on honest negotiations between consenting parties, not fraud and intimidation. Margaret finally found her voice again, but it was different now, smaller, less certain. What guarantee do we have that you won't just kick us out after we've removed everything? It was a fair question, and it showed that she was finally starting to think like a rational person instead of a cartoon villain. You have my word that if you comply with my demands and stop all illegal activities on my property, I'll consider legitimate lease arrangements for some dock facilities. But those discussions can only happen after you've restored my property and made full restitution for 30 years of trespassing. I could see the wheels turning in Margaret's head as she tried to calculate whether she had any other options. Finally, she played her last card. The community will never accept this. They'll fight you in court for years, and it'll cost you more in legal fees than the property is worth. That made me laugh out loud. Margaret, I'm a water rights attorney. I specialize in exactly these types of disputes. I have clear legal title to this property, and I have documented evidence of fraud and criminal activity. This isn't going to be a long, expensive legal battle. It's going to be a very short, very expensive lesson in why you don't try to steal property from lawyers who know exactly how to protect their rights. The meeting ended with Margaret and her crew retreating to plan their next move, but I could tell that the fight had gone out of them. They'd finally realized that they weren't dealing with an intimidated homeowner who could be bullied into submission and to tepses. They were dealing with someone who had both the legal knowledge and the resources to destroy them completely. That evening, I made the phone call I'd been planning for weeks. I contacted the outlet control company that managed the dam system for Lake Serenity and scheduled them to begin lowering the water level by 6 feet, starting the next morning. I had every legal right to do this, all the necessary permits, and a legitimate property management reason, removing illegal structures from my waterfront. The next morning, I sat on my dock with my coffee and watched the water level start to drop. It was a gradual process. The lake wouldn't be fully lowered for another week, but within hours, the effects were visible. The community dock system, designed for the lake's normal water level, was already starting to look precarious as the water receded. By afternoon, several of the boat slips were unusable, and by evening, parts of their expensive dock system were sitting on exposed lakebed. My phone started ringing around noon, with calls from panicked homeowners asking what was happening to the lake. I let them all go to voicemail, but I listened to the messages, and they painted a clear picture of a community in chaos. People were asking about their boats, their dock access, their property values, and their summer plans. Several callers mentioned that Margaret had told them this was temporary and that the lake would be back to normal within a few days. By the third day, the situation had reached crisis levels for the Lakeshore Community Association. The water level was down 4 feet and dropping, turning their premium lakefront community into a muddy marsh dotted with useless wooden structures. Property owners were demanding answers, dock renters were demanding refunds, and the local media had picked up the story of the mysterious lake drainage affecting an upscale suburban community. That's when Margaret finally called me directly. Her voice was different, no longer the cold, calculated tone of a predator, but the desperate pleading of someone who'd finally realized how thoroughly she'd been outmaneuvered. Mr. Johnson, please, we need to talk. The community is in crisis, and people are starting to ask hard questions about our legal position regarding the lake. I'm listening, I said simply, knowing that the balance of power had shifted completely. The board met last night, and we've voted to begin removing our structures from your property, she continued. But we need time to organize the work and find contractors who can handle a project this size. Can you please stop the lake drainage while we work out the details?" It was exactly what I'd been waiting to hear, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook that easily. "Margaret, you've had weeks to remove your illegal structures voluntarily. Instead, you chose to escalate with threats, fraud, and property destruction. Why should I believe you're acting in good faith now?" There was a long pause before she answered. "Because I don't have any other choice. The community is threatening to sue the association for misrepresentation. Several board members have resigned, and I'm probably going to face criminal charges for the forged documents. I just want to end this before it gets any worse." For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Margaret Whitman sounded like a human being instead of a suburban supervillain. She was finally admitting defeat and accepting responsibility for the consequences of her actions. "All right, Margaret, here's what's going to happen. You have 2 weeks to remove every structure from my property and restore the waterfront to its original condition. You're going to provide full financial accounting for 30 years of illegal commercial activity on my land. And you're going to personally apologize to me in writing for the harassment, fraud, and property damage. And in return," she asked quietly, "in return, I'll restore the lake to its normal level. I won't pursue criminal charges for the forged documents as long as you cooperate fully with law enforcement, and I'll consider discussing legitimate lease agreements for limited dock facilities in the future." The cleanup took exactly 2 weeks and cost the Lakeshore Community Association over $300,000 in contractor fees, legal expenses, and restoration work. I watched from my deck as crews dismantled 30 years of illegal construction, removed every sign and structure from my waterfront, and restored the natural shoreline that Harold Morrison had enjoyed for decades before Margaret's scheme began. The personal apology arrived by certified mail on the day the cleanup was completed. It was a single page, handwritten, acknowledging that the association had trespassed on my property for 30 years without permission, that the usage agreement they'd presented was fraudulent, and that their actions had been driven by greed rather than community interests. Margaret's signature was shaky, nothing like the confident scrawl I'd seen on documents during our confrontations. On the final day of the cleanup, I called the outlet control company and had them begin refilling the lake. It took another week for the water level to return to normal, but within a month, Lake Serenity looked exactly as it had when I'd first fallen in love with the property. The difference was that now everyone in the community understood exactly who owned it. Margaret Whitman resigned from all her HOA positions and moved away from the area within 6 months. The various neighborhood associations around the lake were reorganized under new leadership, and several families who'd been pressured into unfavorable agreements with the previous regime had those contracts declared null and void. The community dock system was never rebuilt, but I did eventually negotiate legitimate lease agreements with a few neighbors who wanted simple dock access for their personal boats. Dave Harrison approached me about a year later with a proposal for a small community marina on a corner of the lake that wouldn't be visible from my house. We worked out a fair lease agreement that gave the community some of what they'd wanted while respecting my property rights and providing me with reasonable compensation. Frank Mueller was arrested on unrelated charges and served 2 years for securities fraud, apparently having run several schemes beyond just the lake property grab. The best part of the whole saga was the lesson it taught about the difference between legal rights and entitled assumptions. Margaret and her crew had spent so many years telling themselves they owned my lake that they'd forgotten the difference between wanting something and actually having a legal claim to it. When confronted with someone who understood how property law actually works, their entire house of cards collapsed in a matter of weeks. Looking back on it now, I almost feel sorry for the people who got caught up in Margaret's scheme. Most of them were just neighbors who wanted lake access and trusted their HOA president to handle the legal details. They had no idea they were participating in 30 years of organized trespassing and fraud. But Margaret herself? She knew exactly what she was doing, and she got exactly what she deserved. These days, I enjoy my lake in peace, watching the sunrise from my dock and knowing that every square inch of water belongs to me and me alone. The community learned to respect property boundaries, the local law enforcement learned to take document fraud seriously, and I learned that sometimes the best defense against bullies is simply knowing your rights and having the backbone to enforce them. And Margaret Whitman learned that when you try to steal a lake from a water rights attorney, you'd better make sure you actually know who controls the water.